Hello and welcome to another lesson of عربي بالبيت. Today we're going to cover defective verbs in the present tense. In Arabic, defective verbs are called الفعل الناقص. ناقص meaning they're deficient or defective in some way. In this case, the defect is that the third and final radical is a waaw or a ya. And these are verbs like رجا يرجو, دعا يدعو. Notice these have a waaw in the final radical. رمى يرمي, مشى يمشي, نسي ينسى, بقي يبقى. Defective verbs can be grouped into three general categories. Verbs that end in a waaw, verbs that end in a ya, and lastly, verbs that are schizophrenic. Schizophrenic defective verbs are verbs that hide the identity of the final radical in the conjugation, so it's hard to tell whether the root of the verb ends in a waaw or a ya. But even these verbs follow a very predictable pattern, so it's useful to think of them in their own category. In this lesson, we're going to conjugate a verb from each of these categories. This will equip you with what you need to handle any defective verb that comes your way. Let's start with the verb رجا يرجو, which means to request or plead. Now, if we look up the root رجا waaw in the dictionary, we get that the huwa conjugation is huwa يرجو. Huwa يرجو with a dhamma over the jim. Now, I'm only going to focus on the anomalies for these conjugations, so if you need help conjugating more generally, check out one of my earlier videos. But for now, in the interest of time, we'll use magic to fill out the chart. And one of the first anomalies I notice is that the conjugations that have a dhamma suffix like ana, anta, huwa, hiya, and nahnu, the dhamma has completely disappeared. Let's take a close look at the ana conjugation to see what's going on. Ana arju. If we break this down, we have the prefix for the ana conjugation in the present tense, the alif, the conjugated root, and then the suffix, the dhamma. If we were to combine all this together, we would end up with ana arju. We have a double dhamma, and then we have the long vowel, which is not allowed to have a dhamma. So what ends up happening is that the dhamma over the waaw just gets absorbed by the waaw, and that's how you end up with ana arju. The same logic applies to the other conjugations that have a dhamma as a suffix. The next anomaly is in the enti conjugation, enti tarjina. Notice that the waaw in the root is dropped. Let's take a close look to see how this transformation happens. If we break it down, we have the ta maftuha for the second person conjugation in the present tense, the conjugated root, and then the suffix ina. If we were to combine all this together, we would end up with anti tarjuina. A double back-to-back long vowel is not allowed in Arabic, and so because these are defective verbs, the last radical is weak and ends up losing in a battle with the suffix. So here we drop the waaw, and notice since we have a dhamma, that's uncomfortable to have a dhamma lead into the ya, so that also is going to get transformed into a kasra. And so here we have anti tarjina. Anti tarjina. Next, we have the entom and home conjugations that have a dropped waaw. If we look more closely at the entom conjugation, we'll find that we have entom tarjuna. We break it down like we've been doing before, and if we were to put all these components together, we would have another back-to-back long vowel. Again, because these are defective verbs, the root, the third radical, is weak and will not survive the battle against the suffix. So you end up with entom tarjuna with a single waaw that is from the suffix entom tarjuna, and the same logic applies for hum yarjuna. Now notice that because of this transformation, we end up with the same conjugations for entom and entunna, and we have the same conjugations for hum and hunna. In the case of the feminine plurals, entunna and hunna, these are regular conjugations, nothing was dropped. We just have the suffix, the na suffix, the noon, with the prefix and then the conjugated root. But in the case of entum, we have a dropped wow from the root that makes it look like the same word as antunna, which it is, but it's important to recognize that they arrived here through different paths. Now let's take a look at the verb rama yermi, which means to throw. This is an example of a defective verb with a ya as the final radical. Now if we look up the root rama ya in the dictionary, we get that the huwa conjugation is huwa yermi. And so like magic, we fill out the chart and we notice that again, all the conjugations that have a dhamma in the suffix lose their dhamma, like in ana, anta, huwa, hiya, and nahnu. Let's take a close look at the ana conjugation to see what's going on. Here we have ana armi. If we break it down and we put those components together, we should have ended up with something like ana armiyu. Armiyu, we have a short vowel on a long vowel, which is not allowed in Arabic, and so the dhamma gets absorbed into the ya, and we end up with ana armi. The same logic applies to the other conjugations with the dhamma as the suffix. The next anomaly is in the enti conjugation, enti termina. Here we have a dropped ya in the conjugation, so if we break it down and we put the components together, we'll notice that we should have had two back-to-back ya. And again, because these are defective verbs, the final radical is weak and cannot fight against the suffix. So the final radical, the third radical ya, is dropped in favor of the suffix, and so we end up with anti termina. Anti termina. The next anomaly is in the entum and home conjugations. Here we have another dropped ya, but let's take a look at how this transformation happens. So entum termuna, if we were to break this down and put the components together, we'd end up with entum termiuna, entum termiuna, again with the back-to-back long vowels. Here, again, the third radical part of the root is weak and cannot fight against the wow in the suffix, and that's how we end up with entum termuna. But notice that for pronunciation's sake, the kasra that was below the meme gets transformed into a dhamma, and that provides a smoother transition into that wow. Entum termuna. The same logic applies for hum yarmuna, just with a different prefix. Lastly, we have the verb baqiya yabqa, which means to remain. This is an example of a schizophrenic defective verb that happens to end with a ya. If we look up the root baqaya in the dictionary, we get that the huwa conjugation is huwa yabqa, with a fatha over the qaf. But notice here that the ya got transformed into an alif maqsura, which is the first anomaly that should stick out to you. Let's take a close look at why that happened. Huwa yabqa. If we break this down with the original root, which is ba qaf ya, we should have gotten something like huwa yabqiyu. But this particular pattern of a letter with a final ya and then the harakat being a fatha ya dhamma, it's the pattern of a fatha ya dhamma that leads us to the alif maqsura. The same thing would have happened if we had a letter with a wow, a final wow, and we had the fatha wow dhamma. This pattern as well leads to an alif maqsura, which is how we get huwa yabqa. And from here on out, we'll recognize the conjugated root as ba qaf alif maqsura. So notice that all the pronouns that had a dhamma suffix have this alif maqsura. The next anomaly is enti tabqaina. Let's take a close look at what's going on here. If we were to break it down with our new conjugated root, which we just derived, and we have the ta maftuha for the enti conjugation in the present tense and the ina suffix, we were to end up with something like enti تبقين. Again, this double long vowel is prohibited in Arabic, and because the ya in the root is weak, we drop that. But what ends up happening is we have a diphthong, and so that's why we put a sukoon. We actually mark a sukoon over the ya, and we pronounce this as أنتِ تبقين. أنتِ تبقين. The next thing to take into consideration is the duals. Here we have regular conjugations, but note that because the alif maksura is now thrown into the middle of the word, it goes back to being a ya. The alif maksura can only exist at the end of a word. So here we have the same alif noon suffix, but with a ya as part of the conjugation. The next anomaly is in the entum and hum conjugations. Here, notice that the alif maksura is dropped, and so let's take a look at why and how that happened. We'll take a look at the entum conjugation, entum tabqawna. So if we break this down and we put the components together, you'll notice we'll have another double vowel back to back, which is prohibited. The ya, which is weak in the defective verbs, loses, and we end up with entum tabqawna, again with that sukoon, so that you can know how to pronounce it as entum tabqawna as a diphthong. Lastly, the regular feminine plurals exhibit the same behavior as the duals did. Basically, the alif maksura got shoved in the center of the word, and so it transformed itself back to a ya. And so here we have أنتن تبقين and hunna يبقين. This concludes our lesson on defective verbs in the present tense. We just went over one verb from each category. You should go back and try to do the other verbs from those categories as well. And the best way to get the hang of this is to practice, practice, practice. شكرا وإلى اللقاء.